Welcome back. Today we're going to be discussing the rape culture epidemic in the United States and who's really to blame for it. Thank you for this one, MTV. Nothing makes me happier than watching your irrelevant shit. Take it away.
We have a serious sexual assault problem in the United States.
Anytime the number of rapes happening in any country in the world is above the number 0, it is a very serious problem. So in this, we can agree on something.
One of the reasons why, toxic masculinity.
Now, as I have taken the opportunity to peruse this delightful video that further proves MTV's irrelevant credentials, I couldn't help but notice you didn't really say any other reason why there is a serious sexual assault problem in the United States, meaning to me that MTV, like Sony with their movies, is operating with a clear agenda that is remarkably regressive and bound to fail. Oh well, I get to have some fun with you then.
Now let's be clear, masculinity is not inherently a bad thing. What's bad is when society tells us that being a man means things like strength and power at the expense of being allowed to really feel things.
The gentleman in the picture you used to illustrate masculinity reminds me an awful lot of the gentleman that features in the Mr. Sheen adverts. Wow, 1993 was not ready for 720p. Now, rather than continue joking about that, let's address your points. As most of society has already ascertained, strength and power does not necessarily mean physical anymore. And I think you've got this slightly wrong. You see, society is being undermined by things like the media, and certainly social media, especially that, where it tells us men should feels more and forfeit strength and power based on their race, sexuality, and of course their gender pronoun and so on. So for example, the straight white man should be a crying, quivering wreck and apologizing for everything his ancestors ever did, because only straight white men especially, have ever done anything wrong ever.
Imagine your favorite male protagonist. Is he cold and aloof? Hardened, brooding? Does he scowl, make dark jokes in the face of danger? Well, this is our cultural ideal of manhood.
I'm assuming that while each character was relevant to the word you used to associate with a character, you intentionally left out a black male protagonist, Hispanic male protagonist, and Asian male protagonist to make a point about toxic masculinity. And of course,
white power! White power!
It gets worse when anything that society deems feminine, like having feelings, gets pegged as a threat to manhood. The worst thing a manly man can do is act like a woman.
It's a bit vague to say anything society deems, because your country is so vast, there are so many cultures. I just don't see it as possible to generalize your entire country. I would say that it is not bad to have feelings, and it is also not bad to be manly. It is all circumstance-based, and that's the problem. You don't go into detail enough to justify or explain properly what you're trying to say. You're just making lots of vague generalizations, all of which are fairly easy to debunk by pointing out their vague generalizations and assertions. Lack of evidence does you no favours. I also want to add that there is nothing wrong with having feelings, and certainly those that would be considered feminine feelings, in any environment. There's nothing wrong with it. But there are certain instances where you should have balance. For example, work. Find a job where you are supposed to be emotionally charged and you're fine. But there aren't many jobs like that. They're all simply target-based, maintaining balance. You don't need to be emotional for that. And that's certainly not a desirable trait when it has the potential to be detrimental to success.
Side note, this is also why toxic masculinity is super homophobic.
I can hardly wait for you to showcase your proof of such a claim. And I had to replay this several times because I could have sworn you said in toxic masculinity.
DeAndre Levy of the Detroit Lions wrote recently, quote, "It's truly astounding how many awful things that occur in this world because men are afraid of appearing weak."
And Megon wrote, DeAndre Levy is remarkably narrow-minded when it comes to the concerns of the world. His views are quite simply based on ill logic, irrational thought, and zero evidence. He is making assumptions, assertions, and generalizations without really thinking about every different society, every different country, every different culture, because DeAndre Levy is a retard. Now, I know I usually don't call someone retarded, I don't go on the attack. However, DeAndre Levy in 2006 took out Joe Paterno. Joe Paterno was accused of being involved in a cover-up of a child sex scandal. He was not. He did say he didn't do enough. That's the kind of guilt that goes with you until you die. The reason DeAndre Levy's a retard is because he calls that tackle his proudest moment. Accidentally, but still his proudest. college moment. I want to read a little bit here. A letter signed by 21 former Penn State football players condemned the comments he made about the coach. It says, "We find the recent statement by DeAndre Levy about Coach Paterno appalling, along with the silence that has accompanied it. To joyfully and proudly take credit for hurting a defenseless human being is sad in and of itself, but to couple this gleeful statement with a willful ignorance of the facts and circumstances surrounding our coach speaks to a complete lack of character and moral integrity on the part of Mr. Levy. Mr. Levy's comments reflect poorly on him, his university, the Detroit Lions, and the NFL, and are certainly deserving of vocal condemnation. This alone and his actions show how stupid he really is. So whatever you've got next is going to be pretty worthless, but I will give it its fair shot."
Levy notes that in locker rooms, power is measured in sexual conquests, dehumanizing women in the process.
1. It is remarkable that DeAndre Levy is able to think of anything about the suffering of men and their feelings around the world while in a locker room filled with sexual conquest. 2. Believe it or not, the world is round, not locker room shaped. Not entirely sure what that shape is, but it's that shape. And 3. A locker room filled with testosterone is not toxic masculinity or truly reflective of all men or the majority of those that have what you would consider to be toxic masculinity.
We're so caught up in these toxic ideas that a woman granting her affirmative consent to sex, well, that too often becomes secondary to our needs.
Because our primary needs are, of course, to tell people about our sexual conquests, when we could actually have a sexual conquest. Conquest, yes, let's still call it that. Right.
Let's put that in the context of American colleges and universities, where sexual assault has become an epidemic. Reported sex crimes increased 126% from 2001 to 2013.
It's important to note that you said reported sex crimes, and not the number of actual sex crimes that happened. You see, people have this potential, this capacity to lie. Oh, and I took the liberty of looking at your sources. You've got one on consent that goes, well, initially to your little webpage on Look Different. But under consent is a source. The source is a 2012 source. Don't worry, I've put the 2015 source, the more current source, in my description. You see, I actually know how to do the whole sourcing thing. You don't. Bellend.
College is a petri dish for bad ideas about sexual behavior, a place that often magnifies toxic conceptions of masculinity. Too many men learn in college to view women as things to be aggressively obtained, to be conquered, to be used for our enjoyment and pleasure. That's just part of what we know as rape culture.
Before I get to your little bit on rape culture, I can't help but feel that when you talk about sex, you talk about it in such a bad way that the only way to really resolve this is for everyone to be virtuous and not have sex until they're married, and have signed mountains of consent forms, so that on that very first night as husband and wife, when they may or may not consent or choose to actually lay down and go at it like wild animals, they have got all the approval necessary. Maybe the government should be involved in this. Anyway, moving on to rape culture, because I love the myth of rape culture. And you've got sources for it. Let's have fun with that. So the source you provide takes us to lookdifferent.org, where it says rape culture is an environment in which rape is prevalent and in which sexual violence against women is normalized and excused in the media and popular culture. Examples of rape culture include blaming the victim, gratuitous gendered violence in movies and television, pressure on men to score, and refusing to take rape allegations seriously. And this, again, much like the consent, has a source, so we should look at that as well. It takes us to marshall.edu, and it has, if you scroll down, examples of rape culture. Oh, look at that. That makes me so moist. This is one of the funniest things you get to see. You have blaming the victim. No one blames the victim. No one. Someone will blame the accused, because of course some people jump the gun, or because they are guilty. Trivializing sexual assault. Boys will be boys is not trivializing sexual assault, and nobody trivializes it at all. It is a very serious thing. Sexually explicit jokes. Right. Tolerance of sexual harassment. Well, since sexual harassment can mean a whole multitude of things, it's kind of ambiguous and anyone can take anything as sexual harassment, making the very idea of sexual harassment worthless. Inflating false rape report statistics. Well, if anyone's going to be doing any false rape reporting, it's going to be idiots like you. Publicly scrutinizing a victim's dress, mental state, motives, and history. It's called being skeptical. Until all the evidence is there, you cannot just take someone's word for it because, as I've said before, People lie. Some have done it just for lols. Some have done it to stop someone else from succeeding. Some have done it because they just didn't like them. Gratuitous gendered violence in movies and television. Well, that puts me off watching Spartacus, I guess. Defining manhood as dominant and sexually aggressive. Okay, some do. Defining womanhood as submissive and sexually passive. Is nice to know that your sandwich maker is going to be passive, because women should be seen and not heard. They are objects, not subjects. Pressure on men to score. Peer pressure exists in all walks of life. It is not a rite of passage, it's just something that happens within certain groups of people who are utterly retarded. Pressure on women to not appear cold. I don't know what that means. I assume it's similar to frigid. Peer pressure exists in all walks of life again. Assuming only promiscuous women get raped. I'm not going to make any assumption, because assumptions are poor choices with no evidence. Assuming that men don't get raped, or that only weak men get raped. Based on US law, men can't be. It's legal. It's one of those things. In your law, you have all the scenarios. Men don't get raped in those. Refusing to take rape accusations seriously. All rape accusations are taken seriously unless it has been found to be false. In which case, that person who made the false allegation needs to go to prison and be burned. Teaching women to avoid getting raped instead of teaching men not to. Oh, there it is. We have ourselves a winner. Because only men can rape. Thanks for that. Rape culture does not exist in your country, dickheads.
All the ideas and beliefs that make people think sexual violence is acceptable.
I think it's safe to say in the United States, rape is not acceptable. Although if you keep importing migrants who have not integrated properly, you may find pockets of society develop into areas that may find it acceptable because of their own culture considering it acceptable.
Rape culture includes the misogynist images we're fed in popular culture, where male violence is depicted as sexually alluring and something that enhances the protagonist's manhood. Toxic masculinity, when you think about it, is very selfish. A lot of that is about entitlement. We're entitled to a voice, entitled to a job, entitled to sex. All these things we're told we deserve because we're guys.
On the subject of misogynist images seen in popular culture, perhaps take a look at how they are being marketed. Chances are they're being associated with a product that sells. For example, sex sells. The idea of a woman beating a man at something sells to women. The idea of a man appearing strong or a super geek appeals and sells. Of course, gamer girls also exist, so we'll say geek girls too. Therefore, this is utter trash, nonsense. The idea of violence making men feel powerful, it's all about plot development, how the story progresses. Yes, action films do appeal to men because that idea of fighting is just very, well, cool. But it also appeals to women as well. That's why there are more female superheroes appearing in superhero films, because it is appealing to that market. It's not like Ghostbusters here. Now, as far as entitlement goes, we're not a socialist society, but I do think everyone has the right to speak. So yes, everyone has the right to try and get a job or work, but not everyone has the right to sex, no. But you boxing these in together equates sex and voice together, and it's not right. It doesn't feel right, and I think it's because your arguments are terrible. And you're trying to sell it under the pretense of this all being because masculinity is toxic. Sorry, some masculinity is toxic.
Some of us don't react well when we're challenged. Women disagreeing with us or telling us no, for example. In those moments, we react how we've learned to, with aggression, with harassment, with violence.
I love the choice of imagery as two white people arguing on a stage, debating perhaps as a white man and a white woman. It sounds oddly reminiscent of an election you recently had. I wonder if it's linked to this at all. Grab him by the pussy.
We've got to unlearn that stuff. Basically, toxic masculinity has screwed us guys up.
According to you irrelevant bumblefucks, everything is toxic masculinity if it doesn't fall in line with your particular brand of equality. So I'm going to end this video here because you essentially don't say anything of any importance and you just continue going on about how bad toxic masculinity is. Your evidence is rubbish, your arguments are pathetic, your sources are outdated, and quite frankly, you are an embarrassment to our species. Nice job, MTV, as irrelevant as you have always been. Thank you all for listening.